Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Faith Matters Lessons of Solidarity and Transformation in Faith led Action and Multi faith Collaboration. So, for this PeaceCon session, we wanted to try something a little different. In this session, we have brought together a wonderful group of scholars and practitioners for a series of short presentations. This format is often referred to as Ignite Talks. And for this Ignite Talk, our esteemed speakers will be talking about why faith matters in peace building and social change. Over the over the last few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about how I could possibly set the stage for this amazing set of speakers and diverse topics. And of course, I've decided that the best way I can do that is by talking about myself. I hope that joke landed. So, my understanding of why faith matters in peace work was shaped during the civil unrest that took place in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in the United States. At that time, like many people around the world and in the United States, obviously, who were experiencing sort of civil unrest, I became introspective and reflected on my positionality, my role, and how I can contribute to the movement for Black lives and to the broader movement for peace and social justice. And as a self-professed peace builder, this event made me reflect on what it means to stand in solidarity with those most impacted by violence and injustice. And I asked myself, what does standing in solidarity look like? And I found my answer and my guide in a book called the Quaker Social Change Ministry Manual, which is published by an organization that I was working for at that time, the American Friends Service Committee, which is a faith based Quaker peacebuilding organization. And my search for answers led me to this concept of accompaniment. Reading the tenets of accompaniment helped me understand what it means to stand in solidarity with those impacted by violence and injustice. It confirmed and affirmed that standing in solidarity with those facing violence and injustice was more than tweeting, retweeting, or posting pictures on social media. Standing in solidarity was about, and these are some of the tenets that was in the book. It was about building relationships of trust and accountability with people and communities most impacted by injustice by showing up, staying in the relationship for the long haul. It was about remembering that the liberation of everyone and everything is inherently connected, and together we are on a learning journey toward it. It was about walking together while navigating differences in a loving, respectful, trusting relationship, struggling together, encouraging one another's spiritual growth. It was about acknowledging and unlearning patterns of dominance, taking charge, leading, making decisions, etc. It was about asking for, lending empathic support. It was about disrupting the systems of oppression with integrity and in authentic community with those most impacted and following their leadership. It was also about bearing witness to another person's struggle without judgment while trusting what emerges from the act of listening. So these tenets of accompaniment that I've just mentioned continue to deeply resonate with me. I wanted to share these tenets because these tenets come from the Quaker faith and from the centuries of experience and lessons that Quaker communities have learned in working towards peace and justice for all. And I know that other faith communities all around the world have similar tenets of their own that can guide us as we work towards peace and justice. And this is why faith matters to me. And faith matters in peace building and social justice work because, as I mentioned, faith communities all around the world have the answers and the guidance on how we can all do the work of peacemaking and work towards addressing violence and injustice around the world. In the upcoming presentations, my esteemed colleagues will expand on this idea that faith matters by exploring the significant role of significant role of faith actors in conflict and conflict resolution through case studies. They will highlight the importance of religious actors as agents for peace and conflict transformation. And finally, they will discuss how dialogue between faith actors can help mitigate climate-related conflicts and create a just and sustainable peace. We will first go through these 7 presentations and have a dedicated session for Q&A after all the presentations. So if you have any questions to any of the panelists, please feel free to enter them in the chat at any time. I will be happy to pick them up and ask the panelists after we have gone through the presentations. With that being said, I'm delighted to hand over the floor to our speakers who will introduce themselves. And our first speaker, I know we switched the order. Our first speaker, we're going to pick on Joel because he's joining us from Australia at 3 a.m. So we just want him to do his presentation, and if he wants to drop off, because we want to be respectful of that. So Joel, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and I'm going to put up your presentation so that you can then take over. Here we go. And over to you, Joel.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for that great introduction, and thanks everyone for being here and for participating in this session. So my presentation is about the role of faith in East Timor, Timor-Leste, that little island that was occupied by Indonesia from 1975 to 1999. And my PhD research was on this some years ago. So I looked at the way in which people could resist violence and the state-based violence that they were experiencing through faith in particular. So just a little map there to situate the talk in Southeast Asia. If you're unfamiliar with East Timor, that's a map of the island. In the east part of the island of Timor, and a couple of other little sections as well that go with the country. Of course, it's an independent country now, but it was a Portuguese colony for over 400 years, and then invaded by Indonesia, and estimated that 100,000 to 183,000 people died from non-natural causes during that period of Indonesian rule. Out of a population of, say, approximately 700,000 or maybe a bit less. And during this time, the Catholic faith became very important to the East Timorese. I've got some figures there on the screen of affiliation rose dramatically during this period from about 25% to over 95%. Often literature discusses some factors about why people became interested in or affiliated with the Catholic Church during this period of Indonesian rule, particularly after having 400 years of Portuguese rule, where only a section of the population became Catholic. And there are various reasons that are given, and I've listed them here in some of the literature. There's not a lot of literature on the internal experience of the East Timorese. So I was interested in looking at that in more detail because a lot of these factors were extrinsic factors as I define them, and talking about the positive leadership of the church, or the way in which the financial support of the church, or the rule of the Indonesians that required people to affiliate with a world religion, the doctrine of Pancasila. They influenced people's choices, and these were all influential. But I wanted to also look at some of the internal factors about why people chose to engage in faith more during this period of intense oppression and violence. There's a couple of quotes here from significant people during this period. Bishop Bello, the Catholic bishop based in Dili, talked about this self-sacrificing love that became an important icon or way of living for the Timorese. And Jose Ramos Horta, one of the main resistance leader and later a president and prime minister, talked about how the Catholic Church in East Timor was this solid, continuous institution that engaged the local Timorese culture and experience. So I've identified a few important features about why faith became important during this period of occupation and oppression. And I've listed them here. One was language. The church used the main local language and other dialects in the liturgy, but also in their daily practice and preaching and engagement with people. And that was really important in affirming the local culture, but also giving the people a narrative that they could engage with. Secondly, a spirituality of resistance, as Patrick Smythe has talked about it. It gave them this narrative, this vision, this imagination for understanding their experience of violence and being able to resist it, particularly through identification with the figure of Jesus and other martyrs. Martyrdom became a really important discourse during this period of Indonesian rule. A lot of people died, as I said, and a lot of people were identified as martyrs in this kind of terminology. People who had witnessed to the self-giving love of Jesus, who had given themselves away for others, so that the death of people, particularly at the hands of the Indonesian military or militias, was not just seen as meaningless or a source of oppression that they couldn't do anything about, but actually they gave deep meaning to these deaths, that they're actually deaths, self-sacrificial deaths that helped the Timorese to resist. And the fourth feature there I've talked about, the church gave sanctuary to people. It advocated on their behalf, and it also sought to raise awareness of the issue, particularly internationally, amongst church networks and beyond, amongst international networks, of the plight of the Timorese. And here's just a quote that I find helpful. Suffering for the people of East Timor is not distinct from their vision of God. It is, in fact, integral to it. So somehow suffering became really an important part of the faith of the Timorese, instead of viewing it as a defeat, as something that was meant to knock them down and keep them under the thumb of the Indonesians. Instead, it became a source of identification with God, who could overcome suffering and violence and death, and help the Timorese people to resist. So I used a couple of important theoretical frameworks to help understand what was going on in East Timor, and importantly, of course, the use of various forms of state-sanctioned forms of violence was a way of targeting enemies and trying to get the people to isolate themselves, to not identify with these enemies of the state who were seen to be resisting the state unjustly, and so to identify with the state instead. So they used mechanisms of scapegoating and torture to try to get the Timorese to assent to the rule of the Indonesian state. But instead of this happening, the people's identification with faith, particularly the sufferings of Jesus and his death and resurrection, allowed them to discover a God who suffered with them, who could forgive and also resist violence, and who could overcome violence. So it opened up a narrative and an imagination, imaginative space for meaning that resisted the Indonesian occupation that tried to take that meaning away. And it also opened up a space of solidarity. The people could gather together in partaking of ritual and meaning that allowed them to celebrate and mourn the death of these martyrs, of these people who had died, and also to see beyond death and violence in a way that then put this Indonesian state under deep question. And eventually, of course, the Indonesian state really tried to target the church, particularly in 1999 when when the East Timorese were given a referendum for independence, which eventually led to their independence and a period of UN rule, and then now independent rule. So that just gives you a little taste of some of my research on East Timor. I looked at people's stories, of course, and tracked their stories, particularly people who had engaged in direct experiences of violence, and how faith made a difference, how it mattered to them in their lives. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Joel. I'm going to hand it over to Aisha.
Thank you so much. I am just bringing up my PowerPoint, and here we are. I tried to say play, right? Okay. Well, thank you so much. And welcome, everyone. My name is Aisha Khalif Jorayana, and I'm affiliated with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And today I'll be talking about my research on the ambivalent role religion plays in Pakistan, focusing particularly on a civil society organization led by Muslim women in terms of countering violent extremism and building peace. So this is actually part of a book that we edited. We work with my colleague who's here, Colin Tai and Kristen Schleiser, and which is a part of a book series that we have initiated on religion matters, on the significance of religion in global affairs. So this book, we really sort of explore the question, not how religion matters, but how, not why religion matters or if it matters, but how religion matters, and how can we start a conversation that includes academicians, policymakers, and practitioners. So what we did was sort of, and how I framed my research was that we used Owen Fraser, Richard Fredley, and Mark Owens of 6 different dimensions of religions as our framework, looking at religion as a set of teachings, as a set of community, as a set of institution, practice, symbols, and rituals, spirituality, and discourse. So in my work, I focused this ambivalence of religion in 2 ways. So first of all, I focused on religion, how it affects in Pakistan as a source of conflict, how it informs the rise of extremism, violence in the name of Islam, inform actions of groups that operate within the context of Pakistan, such as Taliban, Al-Qaeda, among others, and the role of the Deobandi madrasas. So first, I examine how, for example, Islam, religion as a community was so constitutive of Pakistani identity. And since its inception, when it was sort of, when the Pakistani identity was being created, it was created in opposition to the ethnic religious identity of the Hindus in India. And so since then, there has been a complicated relationship between Islam and the state in Pakistan. Although the founders of the Pakistan state was secular, and they imagined a secular pluralistic state. And so in this sense, Islam provides believers with a moral framework that guides their actions and plays a profound role in molding both the social structures and the justification of social and political order. So in that sense, often throughout Pakistan's history, Muslim leaders often resorted to the power of religion to mobilize their populations and also use it as a way to justify their policies. Especially under the Zia ul-Haq period, Islam was extensively used, and there was an Islamication period. And to sort of this also was used by groups like Al-Qaeda, Jamaat al-Islami, Taliban as well, referring to the Islamic notion of ummah, to pursue, so build on their political identity, as well as, mobilizing for their interest, their perspective. So the second aspect I focused on was the religion as a set of ideas and teachings, how madrasas have been utilized to indoctrinate groups of individuals, especially sort of during the 80s. And this was done with the sort of support of the Western communities, as well as the Pakistani government, to oppose Marxist, Leninist, and other groups. But also these were used by Islamic groups to create or come up with their interpretation of Islamic jihad. Third, I look at the religion as a discourse, how different interpretations or contested interpretations of jihad has been used by different groups. So in terms of the source of conflict resolution, what I looked at the role of an organization called Paiman, which was co-founded by a Muslim woman called Musarat Kadim. And here too, I looked at the role of religion as a Muslim identity. So this was I actually skipped this one. So Paiman's work is, I think, is particularly important. And one of the reasons I focused on this organization and role of Musarat Kadim is because Muslim religious women of faith, are one of the most unheard voices when it comes to peace building, countering violent extremism. And so when you want to do religion and peace building, you focus on religious actors, which are often males. And when you want to do gender component, there has been more emphasis on reaching out to secular organizations. But one of the most understudied and most underexplored potential role comes from women of faith. And I argue that there are unique aspects, unique qualifications, and skill sets that women of faith bring that is not available to both male religious actors as well as secular female actors. So I'm not going to go into all the details of what Paimon does, but one of the things that I focused on was that Paimon also, as a sort of uses Islamic identity as a source of credibility, legitimacy, and how it helps them to connect with responding to groups that use Islam to justify violence. This Islamic identity as part of the Ummah as community helps them gain credibility to counteract them. So I also focused on religion as practice. Here, how service for women provides using Islam as a framework to serve women who were impacted by conflict. One of the advantages of women of faith is that they actually can relate to and interact with religious actors as well as religiously motivated youth, but also bring in perspective of gender with women's issues, etc. So they have a better understanding because of the ability to talk with women more comfortably under these contexts, to have a better understanding of the differentiated impacts of conflict on men and women. And so they work with women as both victims, as supporters of extremist organizations, as well as responders to violent extremism. And so thirdly, I look at religion as a teaching, how they engage religious values, principles to counter violent extremist narratives, how they integrate religion as an important element of their cultural norms, and so fight back the lack of understanding of Islam. So this could also be used under discourse as well. So and so how they counter the narratives of these extremist groups. So finally, just the implications of our research is that we need to really understand the role of religion, but this means we have to also bridge the gap between secular and religious actors, because still religious actors, especially when it comes to Muslim world with Muslim women, they're still in the fringes. And we really need to understand these dynamics of religion much more intensely. So we also have to bridge the divide between faith traditions. We need to have much more deeper cooperation. Also, when we say faith traditions, we also have to understand different sects and different groups within that tradition, as well as between other traditions. So learn from each other how we face these challenges. We also need to bridge the divide between academics, policymakers, and practitioners. We're all siloed and we don't always communicate. So one of our efforts is to how do we make this dialogue more constructive and easily accessible. More evaluation, I think, focusing on the role of faith and evaluation. So how we need to look at that more. Engaging women, especially women of faith, is extremely, extremely important. And this has been done very, very little research on this, especially involving Muslim women. There's a lot of work on how to emancipate Muslim women, which is actually itself is disempowering, rather than seeing women of faith from Muslim countries as active, powerful agents who can respond to the problems of their communities more effectively. Of course, better inclusion of women, better engagement of media, and understanding the role some organizations have played in politicization and instrumentalization of religion very seriously while we're engaging with these issues. I don't have time to explain how all of this operate within the context of Pakistan, but it's really, really important. One thing that also need to do better, our book was just focusing on the Abrahamic faiths, but we recognize that we have to do a better job at incorporating indigenous and non-Abrahamic religions. And we invite you to sort of check our series, and if you're interested in participating or writing or collaborating with others to contribute, we'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Aisha. Pauline, over to you.
Thank you. So,
do you want me to help you with the PowerPoint, Pauline? No, you got it? Okay.
You never know.
You got it. Here we go.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps I did need some help.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you to everybody, and it's great to be here. So I'm going to briefly talk to you a little bit about my research, which has been on religion in Israel's internal land rights conflict. Whoa, okay, I've got something else up here.
There we go.
Thank you. Okay. So, first of all, a little bit about the Negev Bedouin in Israel. They're an indigenous people of the Negev, southern area desert in Israel. They came originally from the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th and 19th centuries to the land then known, of course, as Palestine. Historically, they're a semi-nomadic community engaged in animal herding and grazing and agriculture. Of course, some of that has changed, and many Negev Bedouin now are involved in education and various other occupations. So I want to talk to you a little bit about their experience since the founding of the State of Israel as regards land rights. So with the War of Independence in Israel between 48 and 49, the majority of Bedouin fled, and many of them going to places like the Hebron Mountains or the Sinai. After the War of Independence, many returned, but the initial aftermath for Negev Bedouin was devastating in terms of the fact that the Israeli state had taken all their land. Now, these are historical lands that they have lived on for centuries. So between 1953 and the current time, the Israeli state used a four-pronged approach to Bedouin land rights. So the first one was that small numbers of Bedouin were allowed to lease back the land to pay an amount each year from the Israeli state. Some agreed to be resettled in one of the 7 towns built by the government since the mid-1960s. Some Bedouin agreed to move to land that the Israeli state allocated to them, and there they've developed small villages, quite small towns, some of them, and they're referred to by the Israeli state as recognized villages. Some Bedouin, according to the Israeli state, continue to live illegally on land known as unrecognized villages, and these unrecognized villages are regularly under threat and actually have been demolished by Israeli authorities. So my work was looking at how key aspects of how Judaism in Israel supports and promotes Israel's land right conflicts on the one hand, and how Judaism in the same context can actually challenge and promote the opposite. So the key things I found amongst certain establishments, in Jewish establishments in Israel, was 3 key things. First, religion is community. Religion, we know, provides a sense of community. And for the dominant traditions of Judaism, that's Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, Judaism in Israel, religion is community is about promoting exclusive identity. And if you're not within those communities, then actually you are definitely other, and you can be seen as a threat to the safety of Judaism and the Jewish people. And it promotes a xenophobic nationalism. Looking at normative teachings and practice, there is a predominantly exclusionist theology, which promotes ideas that modern day Israel is the reinstatement of the biblical promised land, that God is a tribal God, that the land is only for Jews, and therefore others who live there, who obviously were there before the Israeli state was founded, are faced with serious difficulties from these Jews who believe that actually they shouldn't be there, or if they are, non-Jews should be subjugated. An institution, the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox establishments of Judaism in Israel are extremely powerful in their influence in the religion-state relationship, and they have certainly supported the growth of a liberal democracy in Israel, particularly since the 1980s, the rise of right-wing politics, and the overall government agenda of Judaization of the Negev. So the other side is I looked at how Judaism in Israel is aiming to contribute to the resolution of land conflicts. And these expressions of Judaism predominantly come from the Reform and liberal traditions in Judaism, although not totally exclusively, but they are the majority that are promoting this different interpretation of Judaism. Looking at the teachings from the Torah and also classical Judaism, they're emphasizing the teachings and practice of care and love of stranger and neighbor, social justice, peace, freedom. And these values and concepts are actually articulated in the 1948 founding declaration of the establishment of Israel, to which the government of that day gave a specific commitment to ensure that these values were practiced for all people. This type of Judaism wants to build trust, and it does so through community, networks, social relationships, reflecting mutual interests that are theologically based within Jewish teaching. And on perhaps the more political side, this expression of Judaism promotes a common Israeli identity, recognizing there is diversity, not wanting to homogenize everybody, but the concept also of a common humanity. So one of the organizations that I looked at was Rabbis for Human Rights. And this organization, they're made up of rabbis and rabbinical students within Israel. The focus of their work is varied, and I'll just briefly mention that. They focus particularly on Palestinian rights in the occupied territories and on rights of the Bedouin community located in the Negev. And what does their work involve? Well, it involves legal advocacy, lobbying Knesset and Israel's Supreme Court, non-violent public vigils and demonstrations, when there are demolition threats and when the bulldozers turn up at some of the illegal villages from time to time in the Negev. Rabbis for Human Rights aim to have a presence there to observe and monitor the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces and other security forces. And every year they accompany Palestinian farmers in the occupied territories to protect them from Jewish settler attacks during harvest times, and do actually participate in helping Palestinian farmers bring in their harvest. So what is the theological justification of the work for Rabbis for Human Rights? So predominantly, the theological justification is located in particularly love of stranger, but also love of neighbor, which is dominant in the Hebrew scriptures. Examples are in the book of Leviticus, when it says, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong that person. The stranger who resides with you shall be as one of your citizens. You shall love them as yourself. Also in Exodus, emphasis on not oppressing the stranger in any way. In the book of Deuteronomy, references that practicing justice towards the stranger is essential. And unjust treatment is identified as a serious violation of God's commands, also in Deuteronomy. Other teachings, and these are particularly directed perhaps to the concept of neighbor, but then surely these Bedouins are neighbors. And in the Ten Commandments, there are teachings there about treatment and behavior towards neighbors. In Leviticus, the importance of treating a neighbor fairly and not perverting justice is stated. And in Jeremiah, for example, exploitation of neighbor is warned against because it repudiates justice and righteousness. So the theological basis of this organization, as of other religious-based organizations working on these types of issues in Israel, is very rich and very strong. And it's about rebalancing that theological understanding within the Jewish community. So the summary which you can see here, is basically that the work of Rabbis for Human Rights and other religious-based organizations can do the following things. Definitely challenge the dominant religious exclusionist theology of the Orthodox and Haredi Jewish establishments, and definitely present challenges to state and government in this environment of the growth of an illiberal democracy. Contribute to the growth of a more progressive and universalistic interpretation of Jewish law that definitely supports human rights protections for non-Jews. And some of this new progressive interpretation has been seen in some of the rulings of the Israeli Supreme Court since the mid-1990s, but it has been battered about since and during the period of particularly Netanyahu and his governments. Witness to both religious and secular Israeli Jews that there remains a moral conscience in Israel concerning the treatment of all citizens of Israel. And through their work, they demonstrate that this moral conscience reflects and expresses the prophetic teachings of justice, peace, and freedom for all, which is specified in the founding declaration of the State of Israel in 1948. So definitely the work of these organizations are also in trying to influence within the spectrum of Judaism to reclaim these teachings and also to challenge the political establishment as to why, if they claim to be a Jewish and democratic state, that these values need to be upheld and emphasized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Yeah, wonderful presentation. I am really excited to hand over the floor to our colleagues from Kyrgyzstan. So I am going to hand it over to Emil.
Thank you very much, sir, and dear colleagues. My paper is titled, it's not really a paper, my presentation is titled Religion, Mobility and Boundary Crossing, Tablighi Jamaat's Contribution to the Resolution of Ethnic Conflicts in Kyrgyzstan. I'm an anthropologist from the American University of Central Asia, and yes, my engagement with Tablighi Jamaat was fairly long, for nearly 20 years. I'm currently finishing my manuscript. I've been working on it for 2 years. It's titled Kyrgyz Tablighi Jamaat, the Spiritual Nomads of Central Asia. So, but today I would like to talk about one particular aspect of it, right? And that is connection of Tablighi Jamaat to, or the potential that groups like Tablighi Jamaat have towards the resolution of ethnic conflicts in Kyrgyzstan. I only have 4 slides, and this one will intends to introduce you to the, give you a little bit of background. The Tablighi Jamaat is an Islamic movement that originated in the end of 1920s in India. And the main purpose of the movement is actually not so much to convert other people to Islam, but mostly target Muslim community and encourage them to be better Muslims. Right? And what makes Tablighi Jamaat unique and different from other groups, right, is its mobility. The regular participants of the Jamaat are expected to travel for at least 3 days a month, 40 days a year, and at least once in their lifetime, they are encouraged to go on a 4-month journey. And so during these journeys, they usually sleep in the mosque, visit local communities, invite Muslims to the mosques, and build a relationship with the local communities, but also spend time a lot socializing within the Jamaat, learning about Islam, etc. Right? And since the late 1920s, it's been almost a century, and Tablighi Jamaat has become a truly global movement. It can be found almost anywhere in the world, and the only space, a fairly vast geographical space where it is not very active and even banned as illegal, is the territory of the former Soviet Union. Right? It so happened that in the early 90s, Tablighi Jamaat became popular in Russia, in all of the Central Asian countries, but then following kind of the crackdown on Islamic groups after the war in Chechnya, in the context of the war on terror, after September 11 events, Russia and then many other Central Asian countries banned this movement as illegal, along with almost all other Islamic movements. And that's why it's very interesting that the only former Soviet country where Tablighi Jamaat is not only legal but also is extremely popular is Kyrgyzstan, right? And in my book, I'm making a specific argument why this is the case, right? But maybe one way to look at it, right, is to look at the popularity of and the spread of Tablighi Jamaat in the southern Kyrgyzstan. So southern Kyrgyzstan is a place that borders with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and it's the place that has a large proportion of ethnic Uzbek population, right? Almost half, right, of the population in the southern Kyrgyzstan are ethnic Uzbeks. And if you look at the way people of different ethnic groups engage in the southern Kyrgyzstan in the Tablighi Jamaat movement, you can see that the majority of people who are becoming involved are ethnic Kyrgyz, right? While ethnic Uzbek, for some reason, right, are not so active, right? And if you look at all major cities in the south, like Osh, Jalabad, Isfahan, Naukat, Bazar Korbon, all the cities that have large ethnic Uzbek population, they are not very active in Tablighi Jamaat, with only one exception, right? And that is the city of Uzgen. And I'm going to come back to the city again in my next slide, where I talk about ethnic conflicts. Shakira Tajer, in the next presentation, will talk probably more about this. But yes, Kyrgyzstan had a few very dark pages in its history, mostly related to this tragic ethnic conflicts that took place predominantly between ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbek in the south of the country, right? And the conflict happened because of the land, because of the property, etc., because of the influence and businesses. But two major conflicts took place, one in 1990 and one in 2010. And both were followed by very strong bloodshed, thousands of people, thousands of victims, large territories of Uzbek mahallas being burned to the ground. This is both conflicts left very strong scars, on in the memories of communities in the south. And if you look at the city of Uzgen that I mentioned previously, right, it is an Uzbek city, almost entirely populated by ethnic Uzbeks. But what is interesting, right, is that all villages around Uzgen are populated by ethnic Kyrgyz, right? And in 1990, the the city of Uzgen became actually the hotbed of the conflict. The conflict was started and was supposed to take place in the city of Osh, which is about an hour away from Uzgen. But then, because Soviet army got engaged fast and there was heavy rain, sort of the conflict relocated to Uzgen, and then again thousands of people were killed, and lots of houses were burned to the ground. This was very tragic. Then the second largest and major ethnic conflict that took place in southern Kyrgyzstan was in 2010. And what is interesting, right, that this time it spread much wider, and it affected almost all major cities in the southern Kyrgyzstan, Bazar Kurgan, Jalolabad, Osh, Naukat, and the only city that was not affected by the violence was Uzgen, right? And so there are many ways people try to explain this phenomenon, right? Why, and Uzgen is just in the middle between Osh and Jalolabad. Why the conflict did not evolve there. And so one argument that I and a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Aybek Momjanov, are making, right, and he's actually writing his PhD on the subject, is that the particular role of Tablighi Jamaat, right? So if you look at the ethnic composition of Tablighi Jamaat in Uzgen, right, these are mostly ethnic Uzbeks. And Tablighi Jamaat practice involves regular travel of people from the city to the neighboring villages and from neighboring villages to the city, right? So what we see, right, is we see a lot of people moving, a lot of ethnic Uzbeks going to Kyrgyz villages, and then a lot of ethnic Kyrgyz coming to Uzbek city, right? And sort of that helped to create strong social bonds, right? And strong connections, right? And so basically what we see on the examples of Uzgen, right, is how this mobile practice of Tabligh Jamaat helps crossing several boundaries. The first boundary is that between urban and rural population, and the second one is the ethnic boundary between Uzbek and Kyrgyz. One more argument I would like to make about the mobility of Tabligh Jamaat is its responses to several other ethnic conflicts, right? So there, in 2006, there was big conflict between Kyrgyz and Dungans in the northern Kyrgyzstan. 2010, again, what I mentioned between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks, and 2021 between Kyrgyz and Tajiks, right? And in all of these conflicts, so the Tabligh Jamaat mobilized these groups and sent them to the territories of the conflicts to work with the communities and try to bring them to peace, right? So, for example, this 2021 conflict, more than 500 people were mobilized from the northern Kyrgyzstan to go to the area of conflict almost immediately, right? And they worked hard trying to reduce the pressure, right? So, conclusion, it's is very simple. There is nothing overly complicated in it. Yeah, I make distinction, and many people did make this distinction before, right? Is that there is a difference between the religion as ideology and religion as a living practice. So the first, maybe divides communities, right? Because there are differences in the worldviews, difference in perspective. But when the religion becomes a living practice, it actually has the potential of uniting people of different ethnic groups, of different beliefs, of different territories of residence. And particularly when the religion is mobile, right? When it is not sitting in one place, and when the members actively travel, right? They have a very strong potential for quickly responding to crisis, as we have observed with the conflicts in Kyrgyzstan, but also crossing the boundaries, ethnic boundaries, social boundaries, urban-rural boundaries, and thus establishing new forms of identity that kind of supersede the identities that divide the communities. So yes, I would like to finish here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emil. I'm going to hand over the floor to Shakirat. Shakirat, let me put you up there really quickly. And Shakirat, please let me know, did you want me to do the PowerPoint now, or would you be speaking first?
Yeah, thank you. If you can, yeah, maybe I can start. Maybe I can start with the presentation, yeah, and then we can go to the video. Yeah.
Great.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, my name is Shakirat Toktosunova. I'm a country representative of International Org, Kyrgyzstan country office. And I would like to speak here from the perspective of the practitioner who is actually implementing various programs and activities supporting local initiatives. So, and one of the my presentation will be focused on the roles of religious leaders, actually of different denominations in Kyrgyzstan as actors for peace. Yeah, and okay. Our sort of the mission that we have here is to break. In general, our mission is to break cycles of violence and to build sustainable peace by work with people directly affected by violent conflict, fund lasting solutions, and shape policies and practices to reduce and prevent violence and to support sustainable peace. And as well as collaborating all those striving for peace to strengthen our collective voice and impact. This is the mission of International Org globally, because we work in over 30 countries around the world. And while here in Kyrgyzstan, we actually, as a peace-building organization, we tried very innovative approach in engaging religious leaders to be engaged in dealing with different issues related to conflicts and developing the peace. And I should mention here that Kyrgyzstan is a country where we have very different faith groups, faith communities. First of all, this is the Muslim community, but we also have Christians, both Catholic, Russian Orthodox, as well as also Protestant Christians. Also, we have some smaller denominations like Buddhist community, Baha'i, and even like a local sort of faith group called Tengrians. As some of you probably know, that they are it's very sort of old, geographically located faith group in Central Asia in particular. So that's why our mission here, I mean, actually we worked with these interfaith groups, interfaith communities over the last 5 years, starting from 2017, engaging in them in various projects and programs. And with the main mission to support local communities, religious organization, youth, first of all, to improve and strengthen communication channels between the state and public, and in order to engage them for developing sustainable peace, ethnic and religious tolerance, justice, and democracy. Especially, it was important given that the country has gone through, especially in the last 10 years, through very challenging periods, as well as like tension within the community. And therefore, the focus of the programs was mainly for increasing social cohesion. I would like to mention here that, first of all, when we started our work with religious organization, it was very important to actually, first of all, to start the work from with different streams, and one was focused on improving state-religion relations, especially to addressing religious misperceptions, strengthening wider societal tolerance and conflict sensitivity, because it was especially very important given their role, especially in the last years, the increased role of religious leaders and influence that they have on the society, especially for the youth. Then we also, the other sort of stream, and there was also kind of key impact that we achieved, was collaborative spaces to reduce local level tensions, because these tensions were related on one side to internal kind of social cohesion issues, but also external over especially in the cross-border areas with neighboring Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And just yesterday, we also had some incident over the border with Tajikistan as well. Of course, they are related to many, issues related to land management, demarcation of the border, but also sort of related to the tension within interethnic tension. And then also another impact was related to the engaging the state actors for some policy changes, especially given that it was very important to engage religious communities for some issues, in particular with regards to the role of women, for example, also for the role of also engaging in developing partnership between the state, religious organization, and the wider civil society. Of course, with especially instability within the country, it was very important to kind of engage the religious communities for the making the stability in Kyrgyzstan. Also, I already mentioned that this the work that we have done, it was over the last 5 years. So we have to start it first with actually better understanding each religious denomination, community, how they work, engage with their communities, especially leaders, and also their vision. And also they're kind of like, so they better understand the role of religion, religious organization in democratic and in very important circular state. I already mentioned that that religious leaders play a very important role in social cohesion, and like is one of the key actors in increasing social cohesion. And it was done through first of all, establishing dialogue platforms, both at the national level as well as the community, regional level. At the regional level, it was very important for us also establish youth discussion clubs. This was sort of an interesting instrument where we've been engaging not only the circular expert and speakers and youth, but also we invited religious leaders so they can speak on different very sensitive topics about religion, role of religious organizations in democratic state and circular state, about secularity, its role of women, role of education, etc. And then, of course, it was very important to engage self-government bodies and sort of civil society actors and experts, as well as sometimes we've been inviting also national government representative. Also, religious leaders and communities, they have gone through various capacity building activities, including on conflict sensitivity, mediation. And I should mention here that the religious leaders actually demonstrated a very good capacity as mediators in various conflicts because of given sort of their reputation, their influence to the communities. And for that was very important to actually engage them in capacitated religious leaders, particularly imams, because of Kyrgyzstan is predominantly Islamic country. So in through about like laws and regulation and civic in general civic education, so which worked really well. And the dialogue platforms and then also networks that we've been able to develop in the period between 2017 and through 2019, sort of the first initiative when we engaged religious leaders, helped us also to address the challenges we all faced over the COVID period in 2020 in particular, where religious communities were very much involved in information campaign, and also about, like, for example, vaccination, because it was there were a lot of sort of questions about vaccine, whether it would be possible, especially for the religious communities, to use vaccines, being vaccinated. And here we engaged and worked very closely with Muftiyat, Russian Orthodox, Catholic churches, other smaller denominations, to support COVID preventive communication materials, in particular, also on vaccination. And another sort of area where it was, we actually been very much supported by religious communities and religious leaders. It was over the violence against women and girls in particular, and then also family violence, because the principles of the religion also worked really well in terms of like we kind of included into the family values in light of the sort of like prevention of violence against women and the role of women in the families and the communities. They demonstrated really zero tolerance policy towards violence against women, and we've been able to actually implement gender sensitivity initiatives and capacity building programs through these religious communities of different kind of actually phase groups. So this is kind of to give you some pictures of like how we've been engaged with imams, for example. They came across the country of 1,500 actually imams were trained into the civic education program, actually also through the lenses of Quran and some and holy books and the values and beliefs of the religion. I already mentioned about this interface, interface dialogue, dialogue platforms, and I think it was very important as an impact for us to develop that interface dialogue in a dialogue between the state and secular state, and as well as religious communities. I mentioned about like how we engaged religious organizations, religious leaders to the discussion clubs, especially with youth. And because in the country we had, especially last year, it was very sensitive discussion about the secularity of the state. And religious organizations actually they demonstrated full support, 100% support for keeping secularity principles of secularity in the constitution. And also, as a result of all these activities, we also seen some of cooperation between different faith groups outside of the project, outside of our program, where they have been cooperating on various issues, including prevention of violence against women, healthcare, and some social issues, etc. Here you can see when we had the representatives of different denomination groups, as well as government representatives speaking about, same topic, and it was really important. So, like to demonstrate that their unity in interfaith dialogue. I already mentioned about like 1,500 imams across the Kyrgyzstan been engaged in the knowledge building on concept of tolerance, secularism, and also cooperation with us, as well as between themselves and the state.
Shakira, can I interrupt?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Could we really wrap up? I apologize. I hate to do this,
Yeah.
but just wanted to make
Yes.
sure we get
So
presentations and other
yes. Yeah. Thank you, Surab. Sorry. Let me maybe we move to the video. I will just quickly. These are just the photos and some of the. This is just the photos, and then also some information in our social media. Where you can find more information, but maybe we can, which is very quick. It's 1 minute video, so which can give you a flavor of what was the impact of the activities. In overall, I would like to say that religious leaders and the communities can play a very important role in peace building processes. That's why it's very important to engage them as part of the civil society in these activities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I really apologize. Hate to be that person to interrupt someone, but yeah, I just wanted to give everyone a chance.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Yep. And I will play. Great. Thank you so much. Samira, over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. So my presentation is titled Ending the Binary Between Faith-Based and Secular Leadership. And we will actually discuss some theories and best practices from the Netherlands. This present, Saraf, where can I go to the next slide? Okay,
Yep.
thanks. Yep. So this presentation is actually presented by together by me and Alina Jabari, who will present after me. We are both scholars from the Netherlands, and I am also very active in the whole sustainable movement and the climate movement. And Alina is currently also doing some research in Kurdistan. So as I mentioned, we will discuss 4 theories and examples of it as best practices from our contexts and surrounded communities in the Netherlands. In our presentation, the red line or the main theme we try to discuss is how do we take care of the environment? How do we consider the environment? How do we move towards sustainable societies and sustainable behaviors, while also considering our different and diverse religious backgrounds and religious motivations? So the first point I would like to discuss is faith-based leadership. What we often see is that, especially in the Netherlands, there is like a binary between the secular and the religious, whereby the religious realm is, there you have the people who do the interfaith dialogue, you have the religious leaders, you have religious movements and so on. And on the other hand, you have institutions, you have the government, you have academia, and often those two are still too much separated and not intertwined in their movements and behavior together. So what we try to focus on is how can we move away from the binary between the secular and the faith-based or religious leadership and move towards a model of leadership where paying attention to the religious dimension and the spiritual dimension becomes the norm and not something special or abnormal. So I will now give an example where we try to look for loopholes in current existing policies and find out how we can intertwine and make space for faith-based policies within existing policies made by the government. So one of the examples is the Climate Ambassador program, which I'm part of in the Netherlands. So since previous year, the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate, they started a program where they train 7 youth every year to become climate ambassadors within the Netherlands and to address issues of sustainability and climate change within their own communities. So mainly this program is government-based, based on the policies, the regular policies in the Netherlands, with little, almost no attention to religion, faith, and the religious communities we contain in the Netherlands, and also with no attention to the religious diversity and the different religious voices we have in the Netherlands. So what I try to do currently, together with the person you see up here, Prince Jaime de Bourbon, who is the climate envoy of the Netherlands, is that we are currently looking for ways to combine or to make space within the Climate Ambassador program to also include the voices of religious communities and religious leaders who are already very concerned with the environment and trying to motivate their own religious communities towards a more sustainable lifestyle in the Netherlands based on religious motivations. A second point which we try to work on is to pay attention to interdisciplinary work rather than only interfaith work. So what we often see and notice is that also in the Netherlands, we do have a lot of interfaith work. We do have a lot of communities where we do interreligious dialogue, where we get the representatives from the Islamic community, the Christian community, the Jewish community, Baha'is, the Hindu, and so on the table, and have certain discussions where we try to address social and political concerns together. However, even when we do the interfaith work, we are still putting ourselves in the box of the religious groups. And what we try to do nowadays is to study how can we move away from the interfaith dialogue to a more interdisciplinary dialogue and movement where we not only consider the different religious voices, but where we also include differences in profession, where we pay attention to intercultural differences, intergenerational differences, and so on. So, as I said, this presentation, we really want to pay attention to the tensions between the secular and the religions, the religious. And we notice that even if we talk about interreligious leadership only or interfaith leadership, we are still containing ourselves in the religious box. So one of the examples we can pay attention to is the Green Fleet program, which I participated in September 2021, which is a program in the Netherlands where we gather young professionals together for 1 week to focus on climate change issues, to focus on sustainability, and where we do not only focus on the religious dimensions and the interfaith dimensions, but where we try to take it broader into the interdisciplinary. So we put together lawyers, people with an engineering background, people with a social studies background, but also people with more experience than others. So we really try to pay attention to different aspects and not only the interfaith aspect only. And from my personal perspective, this really helps to integrate the interfaith voices in the general public lifestyle we have in the Netherlands, and to move away from the division between the secular and the religious. So I would now want to give the floor to Alina if she is ready to discuss the further examples. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Samira, for your first half and for your presentation. So as she said, I will now take over and talk about the two other points and examples that we aim to focus on in this presentation, of which the third is reclaiming media platforms. So we live in an era of social media and ever-increasing presence of digital technology. And it has actually never been easier to use these platforms for your own benefit. And while there is a legitimate critique in how these platforms may be used by some, and while they will be used for wrong interests, such as the spreading of hate, we need to remember that we can transform and reclaim these very same platforms for our own benefit. In addition, another example that came up in the news a lot recently, which is through the movie Don't Look Up, consider it a direct play on our current political and media responses to the urgency of the climate movement. So as we can learn from that movie, we should not wait for other media platforms to pick up the important messages and insights we are in need of right now. Rather, we need to create them ourselves. Additionally, how do we ensure that the voices and calls that call for awareness on sustainability movement are present all around us, and that we make use of all existing platforms? So an example is, an example actually that I want to go to is through a series in Dutch. So it's an article series by a Dutch media platform called Nieuw Wij, translated as the new we, or rather the new us. So this article series is about, or consists of articles and interviews on how to ensure that our sustainable movement is a more inclusive one, as well as not just considering faith-based perspectives, but rather normalizing faith-based perspective and presenting them as equal voices at the table. Additionally, how do the articles and interviews present insights in how to ensure that we don't lose sight of voices and perspectives that may not be at the table, how to consider those that are not heard. More so, how to maintain an intersectional lens in a sustainability movement and understand how impression can intersect and create situations that, unless we make sure we incorporate that framework, we don't overlook it. More so, how to address environmental racism and make sure that our fight of the survival for the planet includes one that is a better world for everyone. More so, what these articles do, or these series of articles and interviews does, is it aims to valorize academic knowledge and insights into accessible sources, and tries to make certain theoretical perspectives that otherwise way too often stay in the ivory towers or just meeting rooms. So how to make them available to the wider public. Examples of how this is done through the articles is that the articles on the platforms are accessible for free. The articles avoid academic and/or complicated technology/lingo. And in that way ensures the text is accessible to different types of readership. The articles are no longer than 850 words, and there's one article that's released each week with a different interviewee perspective or argument. The link is in the slides. The fourth example is what we would call walk the talk. Walk the talk. So, as also became apparent throughout these presentations, the relevance of the sustainability movement for religious communities is becoming more and more apparent and more well known. Although, often this is still within the binary of the secular and religious, it is more and more well known that religious texts contain important and relevant teachings concerning how to take care of our environment, how to be a better caretaker, how to be its keeper, and how to protect divine creation. However, how do we transform these beliefs into concrete action, and how do we, as we said, walk the talk? So combining our beliefs with concrete action. One example that we want to give from the Dutch context specifically is the one, so we, in Dutch, Groene Muslims, translated the Green Muslim Foundation. So they are an NGO or organization founded in 2009, and as still until now a pioneering organization in calling attention to the sustainability movement from an Islamic perspective. Through their religious vision, the movement aims to transform the Muslim community as one that contributes to solving our challenges with regards to poverty and the climate. They are inspired by the Quran and Sunnah and transform this inspiration into action and activities. Examples that the movement is involved in is information meetings on sustainability, lectures, workshops, monthly walks within nature that also serve as, on one hand, to be more in touch with nature, appreciate nature, as well as community building through walking together. More so, they collaborate with others that share their mission and vision, such as Greenpeace, Groene Kerken, which is green churches, and various student associations. Wait, let me go back to the previous slide. So yeah, one way that we consider an important point here as well is So how do we organize ourselves in sustainable ways? So how do we make sure that our direct actions are not just once-off actions that afterwards lose its momentum, but how do we actually make use of that momentum and transform this direct action into sustainable organizing and long-lasting coalition building, long-lasting work. Another example that I would like to mention, even though it's not specifically from the Dutch context, but still embodies very strongly this idea of combining beliefs with concrete action and walking the talk, which is the Faith for Ecocide law. This is an interreligious coalition that gathers religious and spiritual leaders and voices to express support for an international crime of ecocide. I would like to end this presentation with a quote from Reverend Hendrik Grape, Senior Advisor on the Care for Creation, Sustainability and Climate Justice at the World Council of Churches, where he argues that faith traditions have for thousands of years provided humanity with narratives on what life is about. In all traditions, we find reverence and awe for ecosystems and a call to care about our home, the earth. Through this initiative, we want to bring all traditions, including indigenous traditions, behind the proposal to add a crime of ecocide to the Rome Statute. The crime of ecocide will help us to realize our interdependence with nature, and international law can help us to change our mindset to come to terms with the great challenges we are facing today. So the reason why I mentioned this quote is that it somewhat summarizes, the full argument of the presentation, to end the binary between secular and religious leadership, and to understand that the religious/faith-based perspective should be one that is incorporated in all types of leadership, in all types of governance, and shouldn't be just boxed away as this exotic group of perspectives or people that we call upon every now and then, but should be normalized and valued equally as all the other voices. So this was our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. We put our context here in the last slides. Maybe you want to be in touch with us. Thank you so much. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. Those were really great slate of presentation and really wonderful quote to sum it all up. I apologize. We only have 5 minutes, but perhaps we can maybe take a couple of questions, as it always happens, right? Like the presentations are so good, we don't want to move on. But let me start with the first one. And I think this is directed for all, so please feel free to chime in. This one is from Jeremy, who asks, working amongst Christian groups, Christian growth in the US and in many other parts of the world centers significantly around modern denominations, especially Pentecostal, charismatic, and evangelicals, who now account for over 40% of all Christians. Peace workers often seem to have a difficult time or hesitancy engaging with these groups. Do you agree with that? And if so, how can it be addressed? Or not? What is your analysis? I wonder if anyone can speak to that.
Could I just make a few observations about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a really, sound question and very important. Just quickly, I think the other thing is, not all evangelicals and Pentecostals, from my experience, are perhaps so difficult to work with on peace issues. So I think there's a bit of an issue there about saying, not lumping them all together. I'd also say, are the workers outsiders? Are they Christians? Because that can be more problematic. And what types of partnerships are they seeking to build with these religious groups? Because as our last presenter said, it's important to be valued and listened, not as an adjunct. My only experience is working with Korean Pentecostal and evangelicals in South Korea on peace building and justice and reconciliation in Korean Peninsula. And some parts of those groups are quite difficult. They don't want to talk to you, but others are very receptive. And I think the other thing is perhaps working through other Christian groups, doing intra-influencing, because that's what we do in the Jewish community, to try and influence people who don't have those views. So that's just a few observations.
Great, Pauline. Thank you so much. Anybody want to add anything to that, perhaps? No. Sounds good. Thank you. I think this one was directed towards Aisha. Aisha, Stephanie asks, thank you so much for that interesting presentation. To what extent could the single national curriculum in Pakistan be an opportunity to widely engage state and non-state actors from different religious backgrounds, including women of faith, in order to make the curriculum inclusive and diverse and promote peace and tolerance widely in education? You are muted, Aisha.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to be very brief since we have very little time left. I think within the context of Pakistan, the madrasas who are not part of the single curriculum so far, and there's so many madrasas with their own curriculum, and it has been one of the biggest challenges to control their education system. I worked on a project looking at the madrasa system in Pakistan. Unless you really find a way to respond to the dynamics of madrasas, the system there, it is really very difficult to engage in a unified curriculum in Pakistan. And I am not sure if unified systems always prevent, unless that curriculum has to have very active pro-peace, diversity, gender inclusive points. But still, there's so many groups that may resist and have their own. I mean, this was done in Turkey, for example, having a central curriculum with civic education. It did not really, it had its own shortcomings. I think it's a very big question that needs to have more time, and it's maybe something to explore further. But we've written an article with Mohammed Abu Nimar on madrasa education and some of the efforts that were done to sort of create inclusive, diverse education curriculum in those madrasa education. But there were a lot of challenges there. So sorry. I hope that was some sort of a good answer. But
Emil, yeah, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Just a quick point. We actually worked on the project with the UNFPI on introducing the peace and conflict resolution subjects into the curriculum of madrasa, and this was very successful. None of the madrasas that we worked with were kind of opposing it. Everyone was pretty much welcoming and saying there is not really that much contradiction, and there is a lot of resource within Islamic, already the existing curriculum on incorporating in these types of subjects. So it was quite successful.
yeah, just to add on that, I agree completely. I think that it works, but making it systematically applied to every madrasa, that is where the challenge is, how to get all the madrasas accepted, especially when you have different traditions of madrasas in the context of Pakistan, like Barelvi and others. So how to do that centralized, because otherwise, I agree, there's a lot of resources within the Islamic tradition, and once you integrate it, it has an impact, a positive impact.
Our entire country has only 100 madrasas, so cannot be compared to Pakistan, of course, and they're all under the guidance of Muftiyat, so it's also
Great. Thank you all so much. And like I said in the chat, I'm mindful of time, but if we could, if possible, if we could go over a few more minutes just to address some of the questions, I would really appreciate it. Okay, so this question is from Mary to our colleagues in Kyrgyzstan. So questions to orgs like International Alert across your organization, not just programs in Kyrgyzstan. Are you finding you need to convince staff or other orgs to partner with religious actors? Same question to all presenters. Are we still making the case for why they are trusted actors in the community set of faith tenets, or are we moving into when, how, what's needed? So if we could probably go around the table, if that's okay with you all, with your thoughts, I would really appreciate that.
Okay, maybe if I can take this one, at least the first part of the question. I think it's the question of the shared values, and also the faith tenets as well, as it was posed in the question, because of with the growing influence of religion, sort of like, and also faith in general, especially I'm talking also about of this part of the world. I think it's very important to sort of like engage maybe some not traditional sort of influencers and the speakers. But of course, it's a question of like also common values, common principles, and so then when you have that and engage them, so I think that might be a very good sort of way to tackle some of the social issues in particular. I would say that.
But do you need to convince people to engage, or it's not? It isn't like people are generally receptive to engaging with faith actors. That I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that. Yep, go ahead.
I think just shortly, I think it's more the way how the impact you make with engagement of like wider informal sort of leaders, informal influencers, especially like religious leaders. And from like seeing the impact, and when you can actually demonstrate the impact and share that, that itself will be the convincing. I don't think that there's a sort of like other way to convince.
I see.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I saw Aisha, your hand was up, and I think Pauline as well. No? All right, sorry. Aisha, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we are now beyond trying to justify ourselves. I think it's much more evident. And I think of that because I know, for example, at least within the context of US, Europe, and other countries, there has been more engagement by policymakers to explore how to engage religious actors. I worked on a project with the US State Department to develop a curriculum to how to train state like diplomats to engage local religious actors. And USAID has been doing trainings for the last 10 years. But I think we're still figuring out, how do you trust? Who do you trust? I mean, within the context of US, we have internal challenges like the separation clause of government. So we have some of those institutional, structural things that help us or prevent us from engaging it more meaningfully. We are, I think, at the stage of how and when.
Thank you for that thought. I am gonna move this over to the next question because I definitely want to address all of this, and yeah, maybe bring in Samira, Alina, and Joel. I want to give you the last word too, because you do not introduce yourself. So I'm gonna ask this to Samira and Alina. Any religious engagement is essentially pursuit of cultural sensitivity. Is your interdisciplinary model like cultural sensitivity applied to professions, implying the need for more intentional study of the culture of different professions?
I know that Samira is like occupied for the moment, but I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. I don't know if the person, Gerard Mora, can like elaborate, because yeah, any religious engagement is essentially pursuit of cultural sensitivity. Could he explain what he means with that? It's like, can the people speak, or?
They can like type it on the chat, but I wonder if he's still here. I don't see him here though. So, oh, he's still here. Oh, I heard. So Jared says, I heard Samira say that the frame needed to shift from interreligious to interdisciplinary.
So, okay, so I can elaborate if this is if the question concerns that, what we meant and what she meant with stating that is that usually we look at like, okay, let's get different religious actors, different religious leaders or organizations together, and then they will work towards something, and then they together, offer a voice that is like considered the religious voice or the religious perspective. And the argument here is that rather than, boxing still, like staying within that binary and boxing the religious groups or faith-based leaders as a separate one, we shouldn't like always aim for interreligious as much as interdisciplinary. So how do we just get like different actors together? So again, like the normalization of the religious voice and religious perspectives as one that is an equal, credible one at the table, next to other governmental actors, diplomats, etc. And so to really move away from that almost like exoticization of like religious leaders and religious perspectives, and to rather, and also like, to see them as like, I mean, and of course we come from the Dutch context where, we really have this like secular division, and religious voice is still considered, a less scientific one, a more backward one, a less credible one. So to really reinforce this idea that, this shouldn't be some like exclusive or interesting exotic thing, rather we should be an equal voice at the table. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
I think so, yeah. And I think also understanding the Dutch context was really interesting, because you're right, there's a huge dichotomy between sort of, faith and not faith, right? So faith and secular, exactly. So no, I that does make sense. I just want to ask a question to Joel, because I just want to bring him into this conversation. Joel, I wonder, from your experience of studying sort of faith in East Timor, I wonder if there are some lessons that we all could draw about how best can peace builders utilize faith to push for social change. I mean, you did talk about it a little bit, but I would love to learn a little bit more. And if you could introduce yourself too, because I know.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
From Australian Catholic University, I should have said before I had it on the slide, but I didn't mention that, senior lecturer. And my research in East Timor was done about 10, 15 years ago, but primarily. I think the major way in which researchers in particular can utilize the resources of faith is to be able to engage in it deeply, openly, and I think to be able to take some of the wisdom, I guess, that's on offer from people's lived experience as well as their theologies, to be able to engage in peace. So how are they doing it in their daily lives? What's happening? How is faith informing them in their difficult experiences as well as in their ordinary experiences? I was looking at people's most difficult experiences in terms of violence and torture and so on, but how is faith really taking it up to people, helping people to engage in the ordinary and the extraordinary? I guess I should have also mentioned that I'm on the board for Pauline and Aisha's book series, and our book series, I guess, is trying to grapple with some of that. How does religion really engage in those different dimensions of people's lives? But I think, being able to go really deep into that is important, and going beyond this kind of religious secular divide, which some of the other speakers really talked about, is key.
Thank you so much, Joel.
Thanks.
And I think that's sort of the theme that emerged. I just wanted to kind of maybe close us out with this, is sort of this issue that Emil so nicely put it. It's sort of religion as ideology versus religion as lived practice or lived experience, right? Like, I think that was the thread that connected all of the sort of speakers and presentations. I wonder if you had one final thought about that: a religion as ideology versus religion as living practice.
Well, I think, could I just say something in the context that I was talking about? The expressions of Judaism have promoted an ideological theology that is destructive. So I think there's something for me going on between what do you mean by ideology and theology in these types of contexts. But I would agree with Emil in the sense that, they are destructive ideologies that don't reflect really the real practices that are so richly embedded in our traditions.
Great. Anyone else want to add anything? And then we can close out. Okay. I don't see any hands going up, and I know it's like way past time, but I appreciate you sticking with us. I appreciate you all sticking with us too, especially Joel, who it's probably like 5 a.m. now. But thank you so much, everyone. These were all just really wonderful presentations, and I hope we can continue this conversation, and hope you'll stick around to check out the rest of the sessions as well.